can you prove the existence of God simply by thinking about God? Well, according to St. Anselm, you can, and he presented this idea in his ontological argument. So he first begins to tell you to think of a being of which no greater can be conceived, a maximally great being. He then proceeds to say that this being must necessarily exist because a being that does exist is greater than a being that doesn't exist, right? So a being of which no greater can be conceived that doesn't exist is not a being of which no greater can be conceived because, well, that being plus existence is greater. So if the being you're thinking of does not exist, you're not doing what he told you to do. This means that if God is which no greater can be conceived, he must exist. When many people first come across this argument, they feel suspicious. There is something that doesn't feel right. It's almost too good to be true, right? That you can prove the existence of God this easily. But some might struggle to just put a finger on what it actually is. And in this video, I wanted to discuss some of the objections that have been raised towards this argument. And I think the first one to bring up is the circularity problem. Because what Anselm really is doing here when he speaks about God is defining God as a being that exists. And then proceeds to say, well, wouldn't it be a contradiction to say that the being that exists doesn't exist? The thing is that you could say this of anything. I could say, think of the unicorn that exists and say this unicorn must exist because, well, you can't speak of a unicorn that exists that doesn't exist, right? And you could use this to prove the existence of anything, really. And here's also the thing. Yes, you can't say that the being that necessarily exists doesn't exist. What you can say is that there is no being that necessarily exists. That would not be a contradiction. Another common critique that Kant actually raised is that existence isn't really something that adds to the concept or definition of something. Existence does not define what a thing is, unlike roundness or red, but rather indicates that this concept is instantiated in reality. So the difference between a red ball that exists in reality and a red ball that exists in my imagination is not that one possesses a quality that the other one doesn't, but rather where this concept of which is this combination of these qualities is located. And this is the difference between essential and accidental properties. An accidental property is a non-essential characteristic that an object or entity can have, but can lose without ceasing to be what it is. This is unlike essential properties, which define an object's core nature. If we take the concept of a red ball, for example, well, its essential properties are that it's red and that it's globe-shaped. Accidental properties are things like whether maybe it's a big or small, whether it's cold or warm, and also whether it exists or not. Anselm is trying to make existence an essential property of God, but as Kant said, existence is not a real predicate. A way to demonstrate this would be if me and my friend made a bet about whether blue swans exist. So what we do is we have the concept of a blue swan, which is all the qualities of a swan, plus the quality of blueness. And we are debating whether this concept exists in reality or not. Then we go on a mission to look everywhere and see whether we can find a blue swan. And to everyone's surprise, we do. And then the question is, has the concept of the swan really changed when we find out that it is in reality? Are these two entirely different concepts? That there was one concept, the swan that exists in my imagination, and the swan that exists in reality. And many would argue that it's not a defining factor. It doesn't change or add to the concept of a blue swan. Hence, a being that exists is not greater than a being that doesn't exist. because existence does not add to the concept of something. I also wanted to bring up the fact that when we say the greatest being, I think we are unconsciously assigning moral value to these different qualities. I think we assume that the greatest being must only contain qualities that we deem good. So the greatest being is not great in its weakness, it's not great in its violence, anger, jealousy. It's only great in its good qualities, such as its kindness, its omnipotence, its omniscience, its love, right? But I think we would be underestimating God if we think that he's limited to our opinions as tiny little humans. Isn't he the one who decided what we would think is good or bad? And if we use greatness as a neutral term, isn't a being that contains all qualities greater than a being that only contains the qualities that we as humans deem good? To this, some might argue that, well, wouldn't this lead to contradiction? Because wouldn't this being then, for example, both contain bigness and smallness? And that doesn't make sense, right? So if we use the greatest being in neutral terms, it might actually lead to a being that couldn't really exist. And then some might say that, well, God is greater than the laws of logic. But if he is, then why are we trying to use the laws of logic to prove his existence? And as I said, even if this being that possesses all qualities could exist, I don't think it would fit the mold that we have in mind when we think of God, right? There are definitely way more objections and objections to the objections that are worth looking into, but these were some of the ones that struck out the most to me. We have gotten to the end of this video, but I also think it's important to point out something that often goes unmentioned when we discuss the ontological argument. And this is the fact that this argument is not made for atheists. It's not made to try to convince people who don't believe that God exists that God exists. It is made for theists who already believe that God exists and to try to make them more secure in their faith. That said, I still think this argument has some major flaws, and I do not find it very compelling. Even among theists, I wouldn't say it's very popular. But feel free to leave your opinions in the comments. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. And feel free to give me a like and a subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And thank you so much for listening.